The storm was brutal, tearing through the Alaskan wilderness like a beast on the hunt. Daniel Carter never expected to find a half-frozen grizzly bear and her 2 cubs collapsing in the snow. He had 2 choices: shut the door and let nature take its course, or do the unthinkable. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Stay with me, because this is a story you won't forget. The wind howled like a wounded bee, slamming against the small log cabin in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. The temperature had dropped to a deadly -40 degrees, and the blizzard outside showed no sign of stopping. Daniel Carter sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. The cold didn't scare him. He had survived in these wild lands for 7 years, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air, something that made his skin crawl. Then he heard it, a deep, low sound, barely audible over the storm, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the trees, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. Daniel grabbed his lantern and stood up, his movements careful and slow. Years in the wild had sharpened his instincts. Something was out there. He reached for his hunting rifle, not because he wanted to use it, but because out here, in the middle of nowhere, hesitation could mean death. Moving toward the window, he wiped away the frost and peered into the darkness. The storm was thick, blinding. He could barely see past the porch, but then a shadow moved, a large, dark shape, barely visible through the heavy snowfall. His grip tightened on the rifle. A bear? In the middle of winter? Impossible. They should be hibernating. But then he saw something else. Smaller shapes. 2 of them. Cubs. Daniel's breath caught. He had lived among nature long enough to know what this meant. Something had gone terribly wrong. A mother bear wouldn't be out in this weather unless she had no choice. His heart pounded. If she was starving, if she was desperate, she could attack. But then he saw how slowly she moved. Her massive body swayed with exhaustion, each step heavy, as if she barely had the strength to stand. Her fur was covered in ice, her head hanging low, and the cubs, they weren't moving. Daniel clenched his jaw. If he did nothing, they would be dead by morning. But letting a bear into his home, it was suicide. He turned away from the window, running a hand through his hair. Logic told him to stay inside, to let nature take its course. But something inside him refused to listen. He knew what loss felt like. He knew what it meant to watch someone slip away, helpless to stop it, and he wouldn't let it happen again. With a sharp breath, he made his decision. Moving fast, he tossed extra logs into the fire, making sure the cabin was warm. Then he grabbed thick blankets and a heavy coat. When he stepped onto the porch, the cold hit him like a hammer. His breath froze in the air, his eyelashes coated with ice within seconds. The bear didn't react as he approached. She was too weak, her glassy eyes barely focused on him. Slowly, cautiously, Daniel knelt beside the cubs. They were barely breathing. His hands shook as he wrapped the first cub in a blanket, lifting its tiny, ice-cold body. Then he reached for the second. The mother bear watched him. For a moment, their eyes met. Daniel expected anger, fear, resistance. Instead, he saw something that made his chest tighten, a silent plea. She was trusting him. He carried the cubs inside, placing them near the fire. Minutes passed, then an hour. Slowly, their tiny bodies twitched as warmth returned to them. But their mother, she was still outside, and if she stayed out much longer, she would never wake up. Daniel stared at the door. What he was about to do was insane. A grizzly in his cabin? But then he looked at the cubs, and he already knew his answer. He walked to the door, paused for only a moment, and opened it. The wind howled louder, snow swirling inside. The mother bear lifted her head, her eyes locked onto his. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, with the last of her strength, she rose to her feet, and she stepped inside. The massive grizzly stepped into the cabin, her heavy body swaying with exhaustion. Daniel stood completely still. His heart pounded in his chest, every muscle in his body tensed. If she panicked now, if her instincts told her to attack, he wouldn't survive. But she didn't. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with warmth. The cubs lay curled near the flames, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. The mother staggered forward, her paws unsteady. She sniffed the air, her tired eyes flicking between Daniel and her cubs. Then with a deep, heavy sigh, she collapsed beside them. Daniel let out a slow breath. He had just let a bear into his home, and she had accepted it. For the next hour, he didn't move. Neither did she. A silent agreement. The night passed in an eerie calm. The storm still raged outside, wind battering against the walls, but inside the cabin everything was still. Daniel sat in his chair, watching the mother bear with cautious eyes. She wasn't a threat, not anymore. She was just a mother, trying to survive. At some point, his exhaustion took over. He dozed off, waking only when he heard movement. The cubs were awake, their small paws pressing into their mother's fur as they nuzzled closer to her warmth. Daniel couldn't help but feel relief. They were going to make it. The mother bear lifted her head, blinking at Daniel. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. There was no fear in her eyes, no aggression, only understanding. The storm breaks. By morning, the blizzard had finally passed. Daniel walked to the frosted window and looked outside. The world was buried under thick, untouched snow, glowing under the first rays of sunlight. It was time. The mother bear must have felt it, too. She rose to her feet, stretching her massive body. The cubs, now full of energy, tumbled over each other playfully. Daniel moved to the door. He opened it. Cold air rushed inside, sending a shiver down his spine. The bear turned toward him. For a long moment, she just stood there, watching him. Then she stepped forward, nudging her cubs ahead. Daniel watched as they disappeared into the trees, their huge footprints pressing into the fresh snow. She didn't look back, and just like that, they were gone. 6 months later, summer came, and with it, the memory of that night faded. Daniel returned to his usual routines, hunting, fishing, repairing the cabin, until one August afternoon when something stopped him in his tracks. He was driving home from town when he rounded a bend on the dirt road and froze. A grizzly stood in the middle of the road. Not just any grizzly. Her! Daniel's heart pounded. Why was she here? Then before he could react, the ground rumbled beneath him. A deep, low sound filled the air. Then, a rock slide. Massive boulders crashed onto the road, exactly where Daniel would have been if the bear hadn't stopped him. He sat in stunned silence, staring at the pile of rocks. Then slowly, he turned back to the bear. She was watching him, and in that moment, he understood. She had saved his life. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, a silent thank you. The bear held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned and disappeared into the trees, her cubs trailing behind her. The wild always remembers. Daniel sat in his truck, staring at the empty road ahead. Had she known what would happen? Or was it just fate repaying a debt? He would never know for sure. But one thing was clear. He would never look at the wild the same way again.